What's up guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at how I painted the blue armour on this Night Lord model. I'm not going to show every single surface because really they're all pretty much the same. Once you know how to approach one armour panel, you can apply that across the rest of the model. So for the sake of your sanity and mine, we'll mostly focus on how I painted the leg and the shoulder pad. To start off, I used some scale colour black leather and I painted all the armour parts of the model. I'd already primed the miniature using some Games Workshop Chaos Black Spray. I find these darker scale colours go on better over a darker primer. That's why I've opted for the black over my usual grey. Plus you can also leave the black in the recesses between the panels to help get clear definition between each section. It just saves a bit of time because we don't need to go back later and line everything. In order to get a smooth coverage, I apply this over a few thin layers until the colour is solid without any patchiness. Alright, so for our first highlight, and because we used our shadow for the base colour, this is actually going to be our midtone. And for that we're going to be using some scale colour Cantabaric blue. We'll block that in over the areas where we want our highlights. You could also start off by basing the model in this blue and then paint in your shadows later, but I find this way where you're building up the colour on top of the shadow is a little less hassle. If you've seen my other videos on painting Space Marines, you'll know that I simply block in the colours without trying to blend them out. It does look a little odd until you blend it out, but it's actually quite a good way to map out where all your highlights are without having to worry about getting smooth blends while you're doing it. So it just means that you've got one less thing to worry about. So that the model looks interesting from multiple angles, we'll try and imagine 4 general light sources, 2 coming down from the front, 1 on the left and 1 on the right, and then 2 from the back, again on both the left and the right side of the model. When I'm painting the highlights, I'm always trying to match the shape of the surface that I'm working on. So for example, the shoulder pads are kind of egg-shaped, so on the front I paint a sort of a egg-shaped highlight around the area where I want the light to be hitting. Again, we have our light source coming down from the front side of the model, so our highlight will be around here underneath the light. Then on the back of the shoulder we have a light coming down from the rear, so I paint a vaguely egg-shaped highlight just underneath where the light would be hitting. This time, because of the way the model is tilted, less of the shoulder would be exposed to the light, so I make the highlight a bit smaller than the one on the front. I'm using basic non-metallic metal rules to work out where to place most of the highlights. These little bum plate watsits are essentially flat surfaces, so I'm highlighting towards the lower edge. You could do multiple highlights along the length, similar to painting a sword, but this model is going to be wearing a giant backpack, meaning that this area will be partially obscured, so I may as well paint it fairly simply just to save a bit of time. On the leg, you'll see that I placed 2 highlights to represent a light hitting from both sides. I should have done a similar thing on the other leg, but I forgot. Alright, so I just continued placing highlights on each armour plate. The surfaces on Space Marine armour are all quite basic, so it's fairly straightforward to work out where to place them. If you're a bit unsure about this, check out my video on non-metallic metal highlight placements. It goes into a lot of detail and it should help make it clearer for you. Once all the highlights are blocked in, I create a glaze by making a 1-to-1 mix of black leather and Cantabaric blue, and then I add some water, thinning it down so it looks like coloured water. With a small amount of the glaze on the brush, I pull the bristles up and over the transition of the 2 colours, moving the brush towards the highlight, always pulling the glaze from the darker colour to the brighter one. I do this over multiple layers, letting the glaze dry after each application until the harsh line separating each colour fades out, leaving a smooth transition between the 2. You can speed this process up by using a hairdryer to dry each layer. The hairdryer is going to let you apply many layers in a very short amount of time, so if you're using this method of blending, I highly recommend having one on hand to speed up the drying time. In order to blend out the round highlights on the shoulder, I'll work my way around the outside of the circle, pulling the glaze up and over the transition, going around the circumference. I also try to vary the length and direction of the brush strokes so that I don't build up a noticeable pattern on the surface. So some of my brush strokes will be short, some long, some at a bit of an angle, some straight, and so on. When you're using glazes, if you make your brush strokes all the same length and direction, paint is going to build up in the same spots over time and you'll end up creating a noticeable pattern on the surface. So instead of creating a sort of transition between the two colours, you end up with little streaks forming over the transition, which can be quite difficult to fix. Try and be conscious of that when you're glazing and vary the length and direction of each brush stroke so that it doesn't happen. I also like to use stippling when I'm doing the rounded highlights. I find it helps a great deal in evening out the blends. All I'm really doing is placing little dots on and around the transition to help break up the surface, still using that same glaze consistency. When I'm applying the dots, I try to use the very tip of the brush and just lightly tap the surface so that they go on small and controlled. If you're too heavy-handed with this, they'll go on as rough blobs instead of dots, so you really want to be careful that you use a light touch when you're doing this technique. As we're going to be adding a textured metallic effect, the little dots help to create a shimmery quality to the surface, which will become more obvious as we add further highlight layers. On the leg plates, I switched back to Cantabaric blue, which I again added some water to make it into a glaze. And I used that to add some subtle texture by painting horizontal lines over the transition. Just like the dots on the shoulder pad, these lines help to blur out the transition, while also adding some initial texturing that will build up later as we add our brighter highlight layers. I try to paint the lines on so that they are pretty tightly spaced. The effect we're going for is a brushed metal surface, and these lines are going to help to sell the effect. You'll see how effective it is once we begin to develop the highlights. Just like with the initial glazes, I let the lines dry and then I apply another layer, and I do this maybe 3 or 4 times until I'm happy with the look of the transition. Alright, I think you probably get the general idea now, so I'll speed this up a bit until we get to the next step in the process. For the next highlight, we'll make quite a large jump in colour with some scale colour Mediterranean blue, and we'll thin this down to a thinnish layer consistency. So just a little thicker than a glaze. If you experiment on your nail, you want to be able to paint a thin, semi-transparent line without any pulling or loss of control. If the line isn't transparent, it's too thick, so you're going to have to add a little more water. But if the paint is running off the brush and pulling on the surface, then it's too thin, so you're going to have to add some more paint. To get the nice brushed effect, we're going to start off by mapping in the middle point of each highlight. So to do that, I simply paint a solid line with the Mediterranean blue along the centre point of our initial highlights. On a cylinder, this is where the light is going to be the strongest. You can see that the line fades out a little as it dries, leaving it semi-transparent. That's going to act as a guide for all our subsequent highlights on that piece of the armour. For now, we'll just add a little edge highlight along the top of the plate. Just by holding the brush at a bit of an angle and letting the side of it gently glance along the top edge of the thigh plate. Using that same line as a guide, we're going to paint over it, this time only covering about half its length. Notice here that the colour near the top edge is now slightly brighter than before. This is actually the basis for a lot of blending techniques. You start out with a semi-transparent layer, then you add another semi-transparent layer on top, and each time you add a layer, the colour gets more intense and less transparent. Now that our guideline is in place, we'll paint over it with horizontal lines, using that same transparent consistency. Don't worry too much about your first pass at this. As the paint is fairly transparent, you have some leeway for making mistakes. The idea is to build up the colour over a few layers. Notice that I haven't tried to make the lines really tightly pressed together. These are also painted on fairly quickly. It's much easier to paint a thin line with a fast flick of the brush rather than meticulously painting it on. Just test that out yourself and compare the results between fast and slow brush strokes. Alright, so we'll do another layer of lines, this time trying to fill in the gaps between the lines from the first pass. You're also going to start to try and make the lines longer at the top of the highlight so that they're not all the same length. I find this makes the highlight look a lot more interesting. So you're going to repeat this process a few times, placing the horizontal lines over that initial guide mark until it starts to become somewhat obscured. Alright, I think that'll do for now. We'll make a start on the lower leg. Again, painting on an initial guideline, running along the middle of our highlight, then just like before, we'll add a little edge highlight before painting on a few layers of horizontal lines over the top of our guide mark. To continue, we're going to mix some scale colour white sands into the Mediterranean blue in order to lighten it. White sands is a lot like Vallejo ivory, it's just an off-white with just a tiny hint of yellow in it. I find it's really nice to use as a general mixer for lightening colours. It's a lot better than using white because it doesn't chalk out as much. Now you're going to paint a line down the middle of your highlight, following your initial guide mark, but this time you're only going to paint at roughly half the length. And the same with the edge highlight, just make it a bit smaller than last time. I think we'll just reinforce it a little bit to make the colour stronger. Alright, so once that's in place, we'll repeat the process and paint on horizontal lines over the top of our guide line. This time making the lines a bit shorter than we did on the previous layer, and we'll do this over a few layers. For the upper part of the leg, we're going to do exactly the same thing. First painting on the initial guideline and edge highlight for about half the length. Then painting on horizontal lines over the top of the guide mark. Mix some more white sands into the highlight, this time making the colour really quite bright. This is painted on as a small T shape at the very edge of our highlight. So I paint a little vertical line at the bottom of the plate, then I paint a small edge highlight forming that T shape. And I'll go over that a couple of times to make the colour nice and bright. If you like, you can add a little dot around the middle of the plate to simulate light glinting off the surface. If you do that, try and make it line up with your original guide mark or it will make your highlight look a bit wonky. Alright, and we'll repeat that for the upper part of the leg using that same bright blue highlight colour. You can also add a little dot or two on the edge of the armour plate to help sell that shiny effect. We'll come back to that in a second, but for now we're going to add a little edge highlight on the upper side of the plate here, just with some Mediterranean blue. So again, when you're doing edge highlights, don't try to paint it with the tip of the brush. Use the side of the brush near the tip and just draw the side of the brush along the edge at a bit of an angle so that your brush is just glancing along the edge. It's much easier than trying to paint it with the tip. Alright, so I'll take that brighter blue colour and draw it towards the corner point on the armour plate. Then again with the brighter colour. It just helps to pick out the detail along the edge there to give the plate more definition so that you can see it from a bit of a distance. To finish off the highlights, we'll take some white sands on its own and simply place a small dot right in the middle of the highlight at the very edge of the armour plate. You can see that strong contrast helps to give it quite a good shiny effect. Alright, so that's the basic process for painting the brush metal effect. I'll paint the rest of the foot so that you can see a bit more of that in action. I'm using the same colours as before, and I'm trying to build up the highlights on the upper part of the foot so that the highlights line up with the one on the leg. Being careful to leave dark lines between the details so that they stand out and you'll be able to see them from a distance. This little flat part on the other side is going to be facing the light, so we'll highlight that as well. I'll just let that play through so that you can see the process. Notice that I'm adding a few little highlights along the edge. Leaving some gaps along the edge helps to emphasize the shiny nature of the surface because you're retaining more contrast as you still have that interplay between the light and dark colours along the edge. When you paint it as a solid line, you actually lose some of the contrast, which to me looks less effective than when you add a few little lines and dots along the edge. Alright, so on the plates at the front of the foot, it's the same idea again. First painting the guideline where we want to highlight, and I tried to get the guides to line up when I'm doing this. So once those guide marks are in place, I paint on the horizontal lines over the guidelines, and I do that over a few layers until the line starts to blur out. Then with the brighter highlight, I do the same again, first painting in the guide mark, then painting horizontal lines over the top. To finish off, I come back with some white sands and just add a few little dots to boost the contrast. Alright guys, so that is how you do the brushed effect on those pretty simple armour plate surfaces. Alright, I think that's all for now. Thanks very much for your continued support. I should be getting some new camera gear soon, so you should hopefully notice another jump in quality in the future series. If you find this content helpful and you're interested in supporting its creation, you can do so by signing up to my Patreon feed for as little as $1 a month. Patrons get access to a private Discord server where you can get feedback on your work or just hang out and chat. You also get other benefits including early access to videos not available on YouTube, in-depth PDF guides, and occasionally the inclusion of your own work in videos like this one. If that's something you're interested in, click the Patreon link on screen to sign up now, and I'll see you on the Discord. Thanks again. Bye for now.